Yes, welcome back. Welcome back, everyone, to the kickoff of Day 2 of NATO's Public Forum. And in an hour or so, the kickoff of the official NATO summit, because that's when the leaders of NATO's member states will meet each other face to face right here and at the World Forum in The Hague. And we're here to bring you live pictures, so be sure to keep one eye on us and the other on who hugs, who nods, and who perhaps pretends not to see each other. But first, before I introduce you to our guests for this session, here's a quick look at some of yesterday's highlights.
Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome from The Hague. The NATO Public Forum brings together voices from government, civil society, industry, media, and youth.
We are living in much more dangerous times, and we have to make sure that we defend our beautiful way of life and systems and our values.
Multi-domain operations is not only linking the 5 domains, land, air, the maritime, the space and the cyber. If we want to be resilient, we need to think as a whole society. It's why you have 1.5% which is dedicated to global approach.
Digitalization is not actually the threat. It gives lots of more opportunities to run your own societies, even if you're under heavy attacks.
The innovation, the defense manufacturing base, all of those things working together, we're going to have a strong alliance. And most importantly, that strength is what's going to deliver peace for generations to come.
We have to make sure that whatever the long-term ceasefire or the peace deal on Ukraine will be, that it is lasting, that it is durable.
Then the one thing that is important to me is that we don't jeopardize that peace by forgetting about the war. The number one priority is to stand with and support and strengthen Ukraine in the fight.
Yes, now joining me today to to unpack all of that are wonderful guests. I have here Liana Fix, a fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks very much. Camille Grand, Distinguished Policy Fellow at the ECFR, Rob de Wijk, thanks, founder of HCSS, and Korteweg, a Senior Fellow at the Clingendael Institute in the Netherlands, one of the co-organisers of this public forum. Okay, why don't we kick off with a little quick-fire lap around the table, as it were. What were your highlights from yesterday? Big moments, weird moments, moments that surprised you? Liana, kick us off.
No, the one moment that was important to me was what US Ambassador Whitaker said yesterday in his discussion, because he said in the end he also doesn't know what the US president is going to say and going to do at the NATO summit here. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind, despite the attempt to make this a business-like NATO meeting, to advance common goals. There's always an element of disruption with this president, and this is what we will look out for in the next hours.
Okay, great. I thought you were going to just say, because what struck me was him saying the US has never been more engaged with NATO. It was quite unequivocal as to, some people questioned that. But
yeah, I mean, sitting in Washington, where the Council on Foreign Relations is located, you have learned by now in the last couple of months that there's one thing that US officials say, and then there's the other thing that is decided in the White House, and those two things do not necessarily always align.
Yeah, it's interesting. And one of our guests yesterday, Frederick Kemp, president of the Atlantic Commission, he said in what he hears behind the scenes is that if there's one message, one word even, that the audience here should consider when they're looking at and listening to Trump's words, it's chill. Chill. So don't take everything literally, take him seriously, but don't necessarily take him literally when it comes to
I'm not sure. I think there's a healthy level of nervousness that you should have, because this is a serious situation for NATO, and the disruptive instincts of the US president are there, and they can derail the summit. I think the two words that I would use is we are all doing this to buy time for Europeans to invest and to defend themselves. So my most important words is buying time. Let's get the summit over in a constructive way. Let's get to the end of this year without major upheavals because of US troop withdrawals from Europe and so on, because Europeans need their time and they need the engagement of the United States so that they can come to a point where they're actually able to defend themselves in the mid and long term.
Clear. Thanks very much. Camille?
Well, I'll start by doing something maybe unexpected, which is to put Trump aside for a second and look at what came from yesterday in the message, which is essentially a display of unity on the part of Europeans, essentially a very strong and powerful message in terms of trying to put the alliance on the right footage and making, in fact, what would be normally very quite extraordinary decisions in terms of investing in defense, in terms of this 5% number, which is of course 3.5 and plus 1.5, as we all know, but that is quite significant. And I think the military leaders that were speaking at the public forum, the NATO leadership, many of the ministers that joined us yesterday were very clear on that commitment. And I think that is super important, and it's important to have this on our mind when we look at today's event and focus more on how the President of the United States will handle this. The second thing, my second takeaway is how Ukraine is present on the mind of everyone, even though it's not really heavily on the agenda. Yeah. It was throughout the day a recurring theme for a number of speakers. President Zelensky was in The Hague and is actively present. And I think it's important to stress this because sometimes people overlook the fact that this is such a critical element in the picture for the Europeans. So
for Ukrainians, existential.
And existential for the Ukrainians, but I think it was very important to hear so many leaders stress the importance of Ukraine.
Okay, yeah. Rob?
A little bit boring in exciting times, and it's meant to be boring, especially today, what we will see. And the reason is, of course, and exactly what Camille said, it's about Ukraine, it's about Russia, and you cannot have discussions on that right away. And that is not really a problem because I understand how summits work. But this is the elephant in the room. It was mentioned a couple of times yesterday. And this is the elephant in the room. And I fully understand why this is. But some more urgency would be great. And there was a lack of urgency in the room yesterday. This is a dangerous time. And you would expect discussions on this. And there were very limited discussions on this. And we had a great discussion on Ukraine. That was fantastic. But it was more or less going concern. And I have a slight problem with that.
Okay. I mean, previous summits have focused a lot more.
I've been there quite often.
Yeah.
I remember very well the summit in, what was it, Camille? Was it 2018 with President Trump in Brussels? I will never forget that one. And that is something you don't want to repeat. So I completely understand what's going on. But on the other hand, you have to convey a message of urgency. And a summit should do that.
Okay. Right, we'll go into what specifically you'd like to have seen and heard shortly. But let's finish off this round. Rim.
Yeah, sure. First of all, fantastic to be here, and thanks for putting me at the table. I mean, I've also been looking at one-liners. So what are the one-liners that stuck out, right? Because this is going to be a summit of one-liners. We've already had tweets yesterday evening from both the President and the Secretary General that we focused on. One of the one-liners that stuck with me basically aligns with what Liana said, that you have U.S. Perm Rep Matthew Whitaker saying the U.S. is going nowhere. That's good. Another one-liner, which I thought and ties into what Rob and Camille were talking about, is the Czech President, Petr Pavel, who says, numbers don't provide security, capabilities do. And there's going to be a lot of talk about numbers. About
before you continue, we've got that quote actually. So let's run that tape.
Well, we will not be safe by sheer numbers. We'll be safe by capabilities. And this is what I was trying to stress from my times in NATO, that the Supreme Commander in Europe will not fight with the chart. He will fight with real troops and concrete capabilities, including strategic enablers.
And this is exactly the point, and that has to do with that sense of urgency. I also recall that one of the two Baltic ministers who spoke on the panel yesterday said, we talk a lot about resilience, about how to do resilience, how resilience is important, but let's stop talking about it, let's start doing it. Let's have that conversation about resilience once countries have done the scenarios, done the planning, done the exercises. And so I really see this sense from Central Eastern European countries to, their impatience is tangible. It's like, let's get beyond the words.
And does that create tension with the Western European NATO allies?
I don't know. NATO moves at the pace of consensus.
Exactly. But I mean, to what you don't feel that urgency from a Spain or from a Belgium. So I'm just wondering if there is going to be some tension.
No, and I think
resentment even.
I think one of the things that's good that this summit is taking place in the Netherlands is that now in the Netherlands people are also much more in tune to this. But maybe we should pick allies that are somewhat more behind the pack or somewhat laggard as the hosts of the next summit to really enforce this message.
First, let me pick up on what Bob said, because I think that's important. I mean, to a certain extent, the summit is a little bit like a Christmas dinner with your extended family, right? You have a list in advance of topics that you're not going to touch upon because it's going to explode and escalate the whole thing, right? This is exactly what this NATO summit is about. You have one thing that you can agree upon. You're going to deliver a victory lap to President Trump for his 5% goal, and hopefully he is fine with that, and he agrees that 1.5% and a broader definition of defense spending and so on. But everything else you don't touch. And it is brutal because at NATO's Washington summit last year, NATO agreed to have a Russia strategy. The Russia strategy was buried because there's just fundamental skepticism that the threat perception between especially the US president about Russia and of Europeans about Russia actually aligns, right? They're fundamentally, the United States sees itself as a neutral mediator, and I would argue so far it has been a pro-Russian-leaning mediator in those Russia-Ukraine talks, fundamentally different from how Europeans conceive themselves. And we could go on and on. I mean, there are other issues. Again, the question of US troop withdrawals. That's going, after the summit, this is going to be one big question that will keep us up at night. Are the United States going to withdraw troops from Europe? How many? What's the signal that is going to be sent with that?
Yeah, but that first question, are they going to? Perhaps we just need to assume they are going to. It's just a question of when and
exactly,
where
but the question is, what's the political signal that is going to be sent at this time, especially towards Moscow and Beijing? Then the question is, how can Europeans fill that? Ambassador Whitaker said in the past that the US shift away from Europe will not leave strategic gaps, which sounds wonderful and makes me as a think tanker, gives me a warm feeling in my heart. No strategic gaps, that's great. But can we really be sure that that is going to be US policy? Because again, in the past we had announcements by principals, and then we had what's actually happening, driven by the US president, who alone is the decision maker and might overthrow any kind of promises that other officials make.
And I think that there is too much focus on President Trump. The focus should be Russia. President Trump achieved something that President Putin could not achieve, and that's the rearmament of Europe, which is rather weird, by the way. So thank you very much, President Trump, because we need this. But we have to focus on Russia. And we have to do it as Europeans. So what are the particular shortfalls we have to deal with? What is the plan A? What is the plan B? We should have in Europe a short-term plan. Not a long-term plan, a short-term plan. How can we enhance deterrence along our borders? How are we going to do that? How are we going to work together with, for example, Ukraine? Because I do not know if our defense industrial base is capable of delivering fast enough. So we have to do something. We have to procure drones, long-range weapon systems. You can procure them in Ukraine. How are we going to do that? That is also the elephant in the room. And
Camille,
we really need to talk about that.
On Russia.
No, I think it is quite clear that we'll have to think about that in the aftermath of the summit. I think it is important to stress, and I say this also for our friends in the media, that this rearmament is taking place because of the strategic environment. We do it for ourselves. We don't do it for President Trump, and because in some constituencies it's going to be a hard sell to explain that we are going to spend so much money to please President Trump. We do it because the strategic environment requires it, and we do it because we owe it to ourselves, so that as Europeans. Then I think there is indeed a sort of upcoming conversation, and it's a bit odd that it's taking place after the summit, to be honest, which is this issue of the revision of the US force posture in Europe. And there is, part of the quid pro quo, I would say, that I'm hoping to get from the summit is indeed the commitment to defense spending. Certainly a recommitment to Article 5 as firm as possible, both in the communique of the summit, but also in the statements that surround it. And finally, sort of clear the direction of travel when it comes to that US force posture, which we probably will not get. But at least we have to make this a transatlantic conversation. This is not a series of unilateral decisions.
If we don't get those unequivocal statements, do you think this summit's been a bit of a failure then? Despite, let's put aside the commitments to defence spending?
No, but first of all, I think the rearmament bit is a success on its own merit. But I think what is going to be important is to not have equivocal messages around the Article 5. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that the communique would say the right thing, but what we need is to make clear that we are all committed in an environment and in a degraded security environment, because all of this is not happening in a vacuum. We're not just here.
But is it enough to just not hear anything that equivocates Article 5? Do you actually not want a kind of active statement from Donald Trump saying, look, Article 5 is essential to us, we stand shoulder to shoulder with Europe, and if we don't get that kind of statement, would you be disappointed?
I think we need that commitment from every single leader in the alliance, including the US president. And I think this is the clearer the better. That would be my take. And but we'll see how it goes. I think it's going to be important to also focus on the actual concrete deliverables.
Okay, and let's look at the sessions that took place yesterday. Is there any session, Rem, you think that didn't go far enough?
I'm actually really pleased with what we've seen so far in terms of the discussions. There may have been a number of topics that haven't yet been addressed, because I do think a lot of the focus was on either indirectly about Trump, sort of to Camille's point, we have been talking about Trump a lot. We've also been talking about Ukraine, which we should. I'm missing a little bit the discussion about different regions. Mm-hmm. So what's happening in the High North, what's happening in sort of the Western Balkans, but we might get to that later today. I'm also expecting, hopefully, some words, at least at the press conferences or at the doorsteps, from individual leaders to flag that. Mm-hmm. For me, the big question is, will China be mentioned at all? Mm-hmm. And up until now, it hasn't featured. It hasn't featured in real commentary by the leaders, whereas the NATO summit last year was all about getting language in the final communique.
What's behind that?
About China.
What's behind that?
Rem, on this, I think we have to recognize a simple fact. The United States, under the Trump administration, is not really interested in getting getting NATO involved in the Indo-Pacific or concerned about China. It wants NATO to focus on European security, and there is some logic to this. But just as we saw with the crisis in the Middle East, that there was no specific US interest in getting the European allies involved or supporting, this administration tends to treat this thing in separate boxes, when all previous administration, including Trump one, by the way, was trying to make sure that the Europeans would follow US actions and leadership in other parts of the world.
But I would perhaps even go one step further than Camille said. I think it's not only that they want to keep it separate, there is no China policy, coherent China policy at the moment coming out from Washington, right? I mean, that's what is confusing. You can at the same time imagine, I'm sorry that I'm the one who's talking about President Trump all the time, but I do think he is the decisive factor. That's how it is. You can imagine the United States either abandoning Taiwan, or you can imagine the United States under Donald Trump right now going into a war with China over Taiwan, right? So both scenarios are there. So, I mean, both the China hogs in Washington appointment by this administration, but also the China friends in Washington at this appointment. So you don't see a concerted China strategy. And I think what bothers me more than that is that Europeans don't take their own strategic approach and have basically stopped pressuring China over its support for Russia's war, right? I mean, sanctions evasion, 80% of sanctions evasion towards Russia goes through China. China has not flirted with, if not even overstepped the line of lethal weapon deliveries, direct weapon deliveries to Russia. It has sent so much to Russia that it actually doesn't matter if it's lethal or not, because it's just massive, not only to support Russia's war against Ukraine. And that's, again, where I think Europeans have stopped thinking strategically about it. But it also helps Russia to reconstitute its military to be a threat to NATO members.
Yeah.
And so at that point, Europeans should not discuss, is there China option for us if the United States becomes unpredictable? Should we make sure that we don't have a two-front trade war? Right? I mean, there are some sympathetic voices in Europe towards China now that Donald Trump is in office. Europe should think about that China is an economic and a security threat to Europe. And that this strategic analysis, Ursula von der Leyen is making it, but it's not made in all capitals in Europe, is to me the actual disappointment.
Yeah.
But I think that we are too preoccupied with collective defense right now in Europe. We don't have a possibility to have a broad strategic discussion on our role in the world. We have to get our house in order. And that is exactly what we are going to do the next few years. So we are preoccupied with European security. And then maybe we have some time to discuss a little bit about China, and that's it. But that is a consequence of the whole debate also on the 5%. This is about collective defense. It is not about China.
But I would say that China is a part of European security and collective defense.
Of course.
Because you can't separate it anymore. If your main enemy is your main enemy, because China is allowing you to be your main enemy.
Yeah,
right?
on this, I think the challenge for the Europeans is to think in strategic terms.
Yeah, but that's the problem.
We are failing to do that.
Yeah.
You know, having a seat at the table when it's about Ukraine or Iran is not a strategy. Yeah. It's at best an aspiration. So what is the European strategy on Ukraine? What is the European plan for Ukraine? What do we do to achieve our objectives for European security in Ukraine? What is the European plan or strategy in the Middle East, except calls for peace? What is it that we really want to achieve? And the same applies to the Indo-Pacific and China, in a way.
It's not so much about strategy, but was it a mistake not to let Zelensky be part of this program?
Once you've decided to shrink the program, it leaves little room for having dedicated sessions. I would have preferred to have Zelensky at the table for the main event. He's in The Hague, and that is super important because it sends, I think, a powerful signal in terms of not backsliding too much from where we were at the Washington summit of Ukraine being part of the broader family, but I think that's then it's going to be.
But there are Ukrainians who feel that we've let them down. You know, at the dinner last night, the Ukrainian defense minister was openly saying, he wants to hear concrete commitments from European countries, concrete commitments. He wants a public podium for Zelensky. But I tell you what, we do have a quote from the British defense minister, John Healey. Let's run that because he was talking about Ukraine.
All eyes have been on the Middle East, and it's really important that we don't lose sight of Ukraine. Putin wants our focus to slip, and part of the strong message from NATO is that we will not let that happen.
But for us, Europeans, Ukraine is more important than the Middle East, let's face it. I think we should be honest about that. There's too much focus on the Middle East. And at the same time, if Ukraine loses the war in Europe, we have a big problem in Europe, and we may face an Article 5 situation. If something goes wrong in the Middle East, that this is not the case. Yeah. So this is also a lack of strategic thinking in Europe, and also we have to educate the populace of the European countries in order to make clear what the real dangers are. And the real danger for us is not Gaza. It may be appalling what's happening there. But at the same time, if things go wrong in Ukraine, we have a huge problem here. And I think that is the debate we should have.
Yeah, and I think to play the devil's advocate on sort of the question of Zelensky and his presence here, well, there is actually a concern that Zelensky's presence, a meeting with Trump involving him there, might actually backfire to the detriment of everyone, right? So, and that's it's cynical, but it's brutally honest that you don't want a situation that, as in the White House, to repeat itself, because it would be problematic for NATO allies, it would be problematic for Zelensky, and obviously there has been a good meeting in the Vatican, but obviously the chemistry between the Ukrainian president and the US president is not great, right? And since this matters, especially with this US president, you want to avoid a situation where you don't get anything positive, not only nothing positive on Ukraine, but actually deteriorate the situation for Ukraine or for NATO allies because of an escalation that can occur. That said, the key question for Europeans is, of course, going to be, what if the US supplemental, the US supplemental is running out? So how can we find a way to continue to support Ukraine, Europeans buying US weapons, giving those to Ukraine, and so on? So that's a key discussion that Europeans will have to have with the United States. If there's no money coming directly from the United States, how can Europeans circumvent that?
Yeah, we do a lot. We do a lot. Let's face it. If you look what happened over the last couple of months, then the Europeans did a lot also in favor of Ukraine. The problem is, of course, that we neglected our armed forces for a couple of decades. So we have, in a way, little to offer. We have a lot of money, but we have to restructure our armed forces. We have to restructure our defense industrial base.
I feel like there's definitely been a lot of conversation on that topic, though. Plans for the future, how we're going to rearm, focus on.
Yeah, but it's plans. But you need it now.
Specifically about that quote that we just heard, is there any extra weight we can give to the fact that it came from the Brits? Because this is a very significant global power, partner of the US. The fact that they are underlining the importance of Ukraine, Rem.
Oh, absolutely. I think it was really important to have that signal sent by Secretary John Healey. If only because, like you say, the Brits have been absolutely essential together with the French in terms of corralling Europeans in a smaller setting, so the coalition of the willing, to start thinking about what can we do more to support Ukraine, given the uncertainty about the United States, given uncertainty about where any ceasefire talks might end up if they materialize at all. So yes, if you're looking at a de facto leader for this discussion, it's not necessarily NATO or the EU. It's basically it's 2 or 3 countries in Europe, and that's the UK is one of them.
No, I think on this, the key issue there is to again get our strategy right. So indeed, there is the issue of how do we continue to support Ukraine militarily. The European support has been too weak in the early days, but it's been going up, and it's become more or less on par with the United States, with, of course, specific domains where the US is providing the core of the support, such as intelligence and air defenses. A lot of it is coming from the US. But the critical issue is to get this one right, to continue to bring Ukraine closer to European security institutions, whether it's EU or NATO. It doesn't mean membership overnight, but it means to continue to deepen our ties. And finally, also to think about the day after a ceasefire and what is it that we do to make sure that ceasefire, as the Secretary General of NATO was saying yesterday, is not something that will last a few weeks or a few months, but something that will be enforced, and because we have skin in this game.
What do you think Russia thinks of how yesterday went? And China, for that matter?
I think
or even on China's radar? Well, let's focus on Russia first, sorry.
No, but I guess for the Russians, they are mostly looking at today. Will there be a message of unity? So far for them, they probably are starting getting the fact that the Europeans spending so much money. When you look at it and you take the long view, back to 2022, Russia has succeeded in enlarging NATO with Finland and Sweden next to its border, has succeeded in doubling the German defense budget, which was not a given, has succeeded in moving most Europeans in the right direction on that, and has succeeded in having our military leadership finally getting the right instructions in terms of planning for multiple contingencies. So from that perspective, the strategic military situation of the Russian Federation in Europe has degraded, without even looking into the losses in Ukraine and all of that. And I think this is something that we sometimes lose sight of because we we have this narrative that the Russians are imposing on us, that they're winning in Ukraine and they are so strong and so on. The reality is not that clear. Let's be blunt about that, and we have to counter that messaging. Having said this, of course, what Vladimir Putin is looking at is what message comes out of today's meeting in terms of unity, in terms of strength of the alliance, and I certainly hope that the leaders will have the right direction and the right message, in spite of nuances that do exist, and that they do exist at NATO all the time. We've had heated debates about numerous things, but I think it's really important that at the end of the day, the general message is that of unity and NATO work.
And another issue I think that Moscow is going to look out for is the question of Ukraine's NATO membership, right? I mean, Ukraine's NATO membership has been an issue which obviously has been very high on Moscow's agenda. So what they would love to see, and we will hopefully and probably not get that, is something that officially closes NATO's open door, right? I mean, the United States has said, Trump doesn't want to see Ukraine in NATO. And I do think from the perspective of other European NATO allies, there was a lost opportunity at last year's Washington summit, which was a big and wonderful celebration in the heart of Washington, where basically Germany and the United States, the Biden administration at the time, blocked any movement towards a stronger language about Ukraine's eventual NATO membership and so on, right? So I think that was a huge mistake that we did back then. So where we stand now with the summit is the hope is that the communique, the press conference, especially of the US president, will not say anything about Ukraine's eventual NATO membership. So we just fall back on everything that has been said in the past and just keep the door open of NATO, even if others disagree. But that's something that Russia wanted to change in negotiations between with the president, and that's something they're going to look at.
And this is what's going to happen when we look at the communique itself, right? We're going to parse every word, what's actually been written, but also particularly what's not in it. And what does it mean if it's not mentioned? Does it mean that you fall back on the previous language, or does it mean that you create ambiguity to allow things to emerge?
But this is a money summit. So it won't be in the communique, in my view.
Yeah, well, the communique is a little bit away. Let's pivot now and focus more on looking ahead and actually to what happened also already yesterday evening. The heads of states arrived at Schiphol Airport. It was a massive security operation to get them safe and sound in The Hague, but they arrived. As you can see there, we've got a few pictures of Air Force One in the air, thrilling pictures. Oh no, that's not Air Force One. That's Emmanuel Macron, equally grand.
Mar-a-Lago is like the Elysee.
Macron, his wife, Prime Minister Starmer, the Danish Premier. That's Viktor Orban. Yeah. Lithuanian Prime Minister, I believe we have. Or is that the Danish?
Oh, no, that's Mette Frederiksen.
Okay, that's Mette. Mette Frederiksen. I thought she spoke wonderfully yesterday. I thought as well, very robust, forthright language. And who do we have there? I think that's the Lithuanian. Yeah.
President.
It's all thrilling, huh? These images of cars landing. There were live streams for this yesterday. And then the exotic, disruptive president. There he is, his USA cap. In case we forgot where he's from, I suppose. Yeah, but he's the man of the moment, isn't he? I mentioned yesterday, there were newspaper headlines saying, 32 countries, but only one man matters. Yeah. And I know you were saying, Rob, we give him too much attention, but
I understand
I think
that.
there are two interpretations of how he looks at NATO, right? I mean, there's the Bolton interpretation, who says, well, he's actually just trying to find an excuse to leave NATO. He always wanted to leave NATO, that's the strategy. And then there's the interpretation, he only does all that, this kind of level of disruption to strengthen NATO. To be fair, I think he doesn't even know what kind of camper strategy he has.
Depends on his mood.
He doesn't have it, right? So both interpretations can be present at the same time. It's not something that he has made up his mind about yet.
I happened to work at NATO during the previous Trump administration. And there was an interesting moment after a couple of years in the job, because there were also complicated moments, including at the 2018 Brussels summit. Yeah. But
he literally called out people, didn't he? Pointed at particular country representatives, and
indeed, he was very tough on the allies at the time, already on defense spending, and he was going through the list. But I think the bottom line is that at the end of the day, he said something that he had said during the campaign. He rolled it back, which was when he said NATO is no longer obsolete, which is a sort of odd phrase because things are rarely no longer obsolete, but still he made that point. And that was, for me, the sort of tipping point of his presidency with regard to NATO. After that, it was not completely smooth, but it was the message was the right message.
Yeah.
I guess Secretary General Rutte is looking for that type of moment, hopefully today or in the coming weeks or months. Yeah. I think it is important. Yes, the United States is the biggest ally, the strongest ally. There's no doubt about that. But it is still an alliance of 32, and we see that spoilers can come from other corners. That there are debates in many of our countries on NATO, and that matters.
And bearing in mind, how important his mood is. What do you judge it, or how do you judge it at the moment?
Sort of a summit like this. So there's sort of three levels at which you can categorize them or rank them. One is it safe? Does everyone arrive on time? Were the planes able to land? Were they able to get on time to their meeting? Secondly is the content. When we talked about the content, like what's going to be written in the declaration or not, what do they agree on? Does that show an image of cohesion and solidarity or not? And then there's the third element, which is much less predictable, and that's the characters of the individuals that we're talking about. And unfortunately, a summit like this could hinge on individual moments. Yeah. We've seen that happen before as well, where an entire summit, given all the preparations, all the discussions, just becomes reduced to an individual moment where someone is caught on camera doing something, for instance,
give us an example.
Pushing. I remember one of the summits that Trump attended, one of his first ones, I think, where he pushed one of the European leaders aside because he wanted to stand more up front in the group photo. And that may have been an innocent moment, but the imagery was. And the press had a field day that here was the United States bullying its way to the front. And that became the image of that summit. And this is, I think, the unpredictability.
But are we partly
happens.
to blame in all that analysis? I mean, I mentioned the word that Frederick Kemp used yesterday, chill.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, sure.
Don't focus too much on President Trump, because I don't care what the mood of President Trump is. What is important is that we have a NATO as Europeans that can even do without America. And I think that is something that is often forgotten, because if NATO is dependent on the mood of the American president, we are in trouble. So we have to act. Yeah. It is not that we have to change the mood of the American president. We have to act. This is a European responsibility.
I would agree, but I think why the mood is still relevant is because we have not acted since 2014, right? I mean, and so even if we act now, there will be a period. There will be a period of 5 to 10 years that it will take until we come to that stage. So at the moment, we are unfortunately still dependent on the mood and political Brussels playbook, and I'm advertising it here for free. Had the great quote today morning where they said, well, Trump is frustrated with the entire goddamn world because his talks with Putin are not making progress, Middle East is not making progress, so let's hope this doesn't sort of unleash itself on the summit. But I mean, if Europeans would have started in 2016 instead of hoping that Trump is just still a historical aberration, they would be in a very different place right now.
No, but you need to have two plans. Plan A is hope. Hope that everything will be all right and that the mood of the president will be okay. And plan B is build a European pillar in NATO. Yeah. That is what you should do right from the start. That should be the discussion.
And as so often, I fully agree with you. And I think one of the questions for me looking at the declaration and the doorsteps is, are we going to see tangible signals of burden shifting?
Yes.
So not the burden sharing debate, where the Europeans tried to do a little bit more on enablers, but really burden shifting, where Europeans signal this is the trajectory that we're going in to take on more of the load of European security.
Who would you like to get, what sort of signal are you talking about, and who would you like to hear that from?
Well,
what carries the most?
I think part of the debate is going to be buying time, which you mentioned at the start, for Europe to think that through in much more detail. So I don't expect an ABC in the declaration. But, for instance, when it comes to building up force capacity, taking on some replacement of the US force posture, and it's kind of related to what we're going to see out of Washington with the force posture review, that needs to be choreographed. And the worst that could happen if it's unchoreographed. This is also what I think the Russians would be looking out for, where there's mismatches that emerge.
But I guess the core message here is really straightforward. It's not if the US forces withdraw. There will be significant withdrawals announced after the summit. That we know that. So the issue is, okay, if the Americans decide to withdraw troops from a specific frontline state as part of this plan of drawing down what they call the Biden surge, what Europeans are stepping up and saying, okay, I'm going to take care of that particular role, and I'm going to make an extra effort to be there or to be there earlier and to meet that demand. If we say, okay, this capacity of this American capacity in the domain of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance is vanishing, do we have a plan to fill that gap at pace?
I would hope that those discussions are already happening behind the scenes. Back channels that, okay, the surge, the Biden surge, is going to be lessened. Rob,
you have to identify some critical deficiencies, so that you will be able to carry out your military operation in the future independently from the US. And then you may hope that the US will join. But remember, President Trump is the commander-in-chief. So if he decides not to join us, we have a problem. So we have to compensate for the non-deployment of long-range weapons systems, which were announced by President Biden. I'm sure that it won't happen. So how are we going to do that? We can do that, but we need to look at Ukraine for long-range systems. What are we going to do with what we call C4ISR? So that's a whole command and control arrangement, including intelligence. Can we use European satellite systems for that? The answer is yes. Can we use, for example, the Delta system, the command and control Delta system of Ukraine? And the answer is yes. How are we going to do that? Yesterday, Mark Rutte mentioned ammunition. That's right.
Three times.
Yes, exactly. And you need that. So I can go on for quite a while mentioning all the critical deficiencies we have to deal with in Europe. And because we have to be more independent from the US, because the US, regardless of President Trump, each and every president after Trump will have its priority in Asia and not Russia, not Europe. That is what it is. It is a structural change we face in the world. This is shifting geopolitics.
I just want to add, I'm not a fan of the term burden shifting, because I think in the US context it has been advanced by people at certain think tanks close to Trump and so on, who now, for example, in the Pentagon, and for me, that is a key word that they use for actually something else that they want to see. They want to abandon Europe. They want to focus solely on the Indo-Pacific and so on. I don't think that's what we want with the burden shifting term. But I think the Europeans right now, and Camille has been saying this very often in the past, their strategy is basically, we have to invest anyway, right? Correct me if I'm representing you, regardless of the scenario that we end up, regardless if we end up with a NATO minus without the United States, if we end up with an EU plus and so on, we have to invest anyway. And the scenario for which we invest in, we will see when it comes. I think there's a question still of, what focus do you put on which capabilities, because obviously you will put a different focus on capabilities if it's without the US or not. But the baseline is that.
The important thing is the to-do list is roughly the same if you want to be an ally, if we want to be allies in good standing that keep the US on board, or if we have to act with less America or with no America. 90% of the to-do list is the same. So the bottom line for the Europeans is to understand that in the event of a crisis, they are the cavalry. They are the first respondent. And by being the cavalry, we are going to be more able to drag the US into supporting us in a contingency than by being unable to act and just calling Washington and saying, we've not been able to deploy a brigade, can you do it? That's no longer acceptable by Washington, and that should not be acceptable. And I think there is, from this perspective, the good news is that there is a very significant mind shifting in Europe, where people are getting to that. Of course, there are those who say, it's going to take too long and we're worried, and what about the transition phase? And they are right to be concerned, but it shouldn't prevent us from moving at pace to make sure that we are in the best possible situation when that moment comes.
And we talked about the Russian reaction to that kind of, these sorts of developments. What about the Chinese reaction? How will they be looking at this?
I don't think the Chinese are paying enormous attention to military developments in Europe. They don't see Europe as a military issue for them in the Indo-Pacific, and they don't see they are not present enough in our immediate environment, even though they are, to be concerned. What they are probably watching is how much of the European developments enable the US to rise to the task and the enormous task that the US is facing in the Indo-Pacific. And if I were a Chinese military planner, I would look at very specific, exquisite capabilities that the US has in limited numbers, and that's a fact. And are they shifting from the European theater to the Indo-Pacific, as they've been doing? And is that pivot to Asia that was announced time and again since Obama happening in real terms? So from that perspective, there is a connection, but I'm not sure the Chinese are worried about or concerned about NATO specifically.
No, but they will look at transatlantic unity. That's what it is. If there is no unity, after this day, they will be very,
they've tried to
very
charm
happy
Europeans,
in
right?
Beijing.
I mean, they've tried to charm Europeans. I mean, all these Chinese statements about, we are the ones who are now upholding the multilateral order and so on. I mean, it's very obvious what they are trying to do, right? To say, well, the US is an unreliable partner, why don't you deal with us? But the good thing is that even though we just sort of criticize the lack of strategic assessment of China in Europe, is that Europe is moving to a point where they actually just don't buy those Chinese takes.
But if there is, this is exactly it. So on the military side, I mean, I think Camille explained it very well. But on the diplomatic side, they will look out for what's in the communique. So again, coming back to last year's communique, it was very clear. China is a critical enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. That set off alarm bells in Beijing because it signaled that NATO was starting to also be engaged on China, that NATO could, with US leadership, push Europeans much more to reduce its economic dependencies on China, also for the production of defense capabilities. That discussion is still going on, but if it's not going to be in the declaration, which by all means it's probably not, but I hope I'm wrong, then that sends the signal to Beijing, well, maybe we can still keep currying favors with the Europeans.
I think we have to recognize this. Theaters are, to a degree, interconnected. And by the way, those who've understood this very clearly are our Indo-Pacific partners. The Japanese, the Australians, the South Koreans have been very supportive of Ukraine, have put a lot of effort to help on this front, and are watching very closely what's happening here. And I think this is something which is very important in the sort of more political, strategic arena, is that China is watching how the US reacts in the region. It's looking if the West is united in facing the global instabilities and crisis. And this is where our Indo-Pacific partners, from my perspective, have taught us a lesson of being so committed and supportive of Ukraine, sometimes more than some Europeans, let's be honest.
And let's be blunt, what's in it for them? What's in it for our
For them, the message is crystal clear. You know, when and if something happens in the Indo-Pacific, when China starts bullying an Asian country, we do hope that the Europeans will not turn the blind eye on that and say, oh, that is a complicated...
At that point, do you think NATO could get
the abandonment of Ukraine, right? I mean, if the United States would abandon Ukraine, that would, from the perspective of those partners, send a signal to China that the United States is not a reliable ally, that you should look for other ways. And we haven't even touched upon the topic of nuclear proliferation yet in that alliance context. But in case that happens, we have a whole new debate in the Indo-Pacific, but also in Europe about aren't nuclear weapons the right way to protect yourself if you can't rely on the United States anymore.
And it's not just that these IP4 countries, as we call them, are supporting Ukraine. I mean, some of them are really essential defense capability providers to European countries as well. I mean, look at how important the South Korean defense industry is in terms of supplying capability to a country like Poland and others. I mean, these two regions, these two blocks of economies are more and more interconnected, and also geopolitically.
Could we see a future in which there is a pivot, more of a US pivot towards China, and that NATO gets pulled in more?
At the moment, what's interesting is that the US, at least this administration, is not really interested.
That's
sending a pretty clear message of, we want you to focus on Europe, and we are not super interested in seeing a German or Dutch frigate patrolling the Taiwanese Strait. And that is a little disconcerting for some of the Europeans, including the French, that happen to have about 2 million citizens in the region and a traditional presence and strategy in the region. Same applies to a few others, and 50% of Europe's trade goes through that region, so we can't ignore it, and we should not. But it is true that at the moment it's there, and I think there is a candid debate in Washington on, is it better to have the Europeans really focused on Europe and taking care of European security, or should we be so allied that we do everything together everywhere? I honestly tend to think that the idea of a focus on European security is the right thing to do, because this is existential for us, which doesn't mean that we should ignore what's happening in the Pacific, the consequences of the strategic rise of China and all of that should be on our mind, but it's a slightly different thing than showing the flag in the region just for the sake of showing the flag.
It depends also on the concrete scenario, right? I mean, just thinking sort of in the worst case scenario, if there's a conflict in the Indo-Pacific and the United States is involved and the lives of your soldiers are at risk or have been harmed, there's just no way that Europeans can stand on the sidelines of this, right? I mean, there will be, that is, if we come to a conflict situation, Europeans will not be able to say, well, that's just leave our ally fighting for him themselves.
Well,
I mean,
it really depends how interlinked all those conflicts are. It really depends, because China is an ally of Russia. We have a problem in Europe. I'm not sure if this is the case, because probably we have to focus then on collective defense.
Yeah. Okay, well, listen, one moment, because there are a few images coming in. The time's now 10 minutes to 9, and the first heads of state are arriving. We see there, of course, also the man of the moment, Mark Rutte, on the blue carpet. It feels a bit like the Met Gala.
What's he wearing?
Exactly. This is Schoof, I understand, coming in there, because he's got a bit of a unique position in all of this, really. I mean, he's just playing the statesman.
Well, he's host nation.
Yeah, host nation.
Very important.
Yeah.
No, the host nation in NATO summits, the host nation plays an important role in the choreography. And from that perspective, of course, the dinner with the king yesterday was an important moment, because it helps, set the tone of a friendly conversation. So these things, there is a sort of hidden responsibility for the host nation to make sure that things go smoothly.
And here, we have the Minister of Defense for Belgium, Theo Frank. What's going to be the kind of the way that a Trump might approach someone like a Belgium, who's shown some reluctance with respect to that, that 5%, along with the Spanish.
I think
how is Trump likely to?
At the moment, and if we look at the president's messaging on his way to The Hague, is very focused on those that are stated outliers. So that is really focused on Spain at the moment. It is clear that he will not appreciate if other leaders start finessing their commitment in the room. So I would, if I were the diplomatic advisor to one of those prime ministers, I would say stay low and chill. Chill. Exactly. Don't start a sophisticated conversation on we'll see and it's going to be complicated and my fiscal constraints and blah blah blah.
It should be boring.
It's boring.
Especially since it's a pledge for the future, right? I mean, so that's you can be a little bit more generous on that. I mean, but the problem behind Spain obviously is that there are really few countries in Europe that can pull off the same trick as Germany did, right? I mean, Germany basically, but also for the first time, Germany made it more flexible to use debt for defense spending. Yeah. And many other countries are already indebted, so they can't sort of pull the same trick.
Here we've got some images as well of the British Prime Minister, I believe, Sir Keir Starmer, coming in. What about their? What could he say that would be?
I think the British Prime Minister. It's interesting when you look at the situation in Europe. You have essentially three groups when it comes to that, and the UK is in the third one, because there is a group of countries that are already there. The Poles, the Baltic states. They are meeting the targets already. So for them it's easy. Then there is a group that has decided to move fast and has the fiscal room for maneuver. The Nordics, Germany, the Netherlands. And then there's the UK, together with, I would say, France, Greece, countries which are, I think, genuinely committed to do more, but are facing serious fiscal constraints. And so the political debate is going to be difficult. And then there is a fourth group which is semi-committed, and hopes to get away with some progress, but, they have accepted this, but with a lot of at least mental caveats.
And geography.
We have to round up there, unfortunately, but that was a kind of a suitable moment to round up. We're touching base on the different countries, the different regions. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
That is it now from Studio Bravo. We'll be back in 2 hours discussing the controversial friendship between Russia, China, North Korea and Iran. So for now, I hand the mic over to my brilliant co-host, Donna. Thanks very much, guys.